Hello and welcome to today's webcast of the LaRouche organization for Saturday, March 13th. Next week, there will be a conference that will be being held by the Schiller Institute. It's an international conference and it will be a 2-day conference. It's entitled World at a Crossroad, 2 months into the new U.S. administration. As is indicated there on your screen, you can register today at schillerinstitute.com for that conference, and the link is in the description below. We are going to begin today by showing you an excerpt from a 1996 Schiller conference in which Lyndon LaRouche outlined what will be, if you will, the conceptual outlook that we'll be using both for today's discussions and for the whole of that conference as well.
Man is not an ape, or higher species of ape. Man is not an animal. Man, every individual person, not man as a species, but every individual person ever born is a creature made in the living image of God by virtue of a power of creative intellect, and therefore has certain sacredness of existence, rights, and obligations which no animal has. However, what's the condition of mankind? Well, people have found traces of what they believe to be human life going back about 2 million years. That is, of the recent Cainozoic period, as it's called. Now, we shall look at some of that, the more recent part of it. Now, if man were an ape, or even a very gifted, special kind of ape, then man would have the potential population density and other population characteristics of a higher ape. If man were a higher ape, then during the entire period of the past 2 million years on this planet, of the recent Cainozoic, at no point would the number of living human individuals have exceeded several million. Prince Philip, as usual, is wrong. Over a period of time, and we shall look at some of this today, the human population by the 13th century in Europe had finally scrabbled up to about 250 to at most 300 million individuals. Then this revolution happened between 1439 and 1483. From the beginning of the Council of Florence to the death of the King Louis XI, who established that first form of modern society which we find reflected in a direct tradition from the Council of Florence and Louis XI's France, his Commonwealth, reflected in the creation of the Federal Constitutional Republic of the United States. The preamble of the Federal Constitution, like similar sentiments expressed in the Declaration of Independence, express an idea which is opposed to everything British empiricism stands for, opposed to John Locke, opposed to Adam Smith, opposed to Jeremy Bentham, opposed to the British monarchy. An idea which comes directly from the Council of Florence, a conception of society which comes directly from the initial work of Louis XI, King of France, in establishing France as a commonwealth. The general welfare clause of that preamble is outstanding in that respect. Everything the United States stands for, especially in its fight against the British Empire and the oligarchical evil of the old world, against the Confederacy, and against similar kinds of evil, everything for which the United States stands, for which Lincoln stood, for example, flows from that. and everything good about the United States flows from that role of this nation in continuing until 1901, until Teddy Roosevelt moved in continuing the struggle on this planet against the forces of oligarchism typified by the British monarchy.
Now, it is that world outlook, that American tradition against which the Green New Deal is presently deployed. The Green New Deal is a policy that's going to result in mass death, might be better called the gangrene New Deal, in fact. And we are, of course, completely opposed to that idea, completely opposed to that outlook. Again, if you've just joined us, next week, there'll be a 2-day conference of the Schiller Institute called The World at a Crossroad, 2 months into the new U.S. administration. We're inviting everybody to register today for that conference, and we're urging you to get others to register for it. Of course, it'll be a virtual conference, and therefore everybody can attend. We'll be starting first thing about 10 o'clock in the morning. We expect to be able to pick up a significant international audience as well as the American audience. So now what we're going to do is begin our presentations. I'll say that today we're joined by Richard Freeman from Executive Intelligence Review, and also a person everybody sees here every week, Harley Schlanger, who I think I'm going to almost refuse to introduce since he's so well known. He's basically here. Diane Sayer, who's normally here with us, is, I believe, out doing a bit of campaigning. As I think people are aware, there's a bit of a row going on in New York State around the present Governor Cuomo and many other things. And I think she's out sort of availing herself of the opportunity to make her voice heard. So we're going to start first with Richard and then go to Harley. So, Richard.
Thanks, Dennis. What I'd like to do is just to focus a little bit on something that we presented back on February 6th on this show, just to establish something, and then look at 2 executive orders that have been issued by the Biden administration. 13990, for which there is a growing opposition, which is very healthy, led by a lawsuit that was brought by the Attorney General of Missouri, Eric Schmidt. And one that's less known, but actually is extremely important, 14008. And we'll look at that. And then something called Making Mission Happen, which is a blueprint for pulling down those critical features of a physical economy without which you cannot have a physical economy. And it's run by something called the Energy Transition Commission. And therefore, look at what that means for what we're doing. And just to emphasize what you could call the clock, if you want, on this Green New Deal is running very, very quickly. We're much more advanced than I think some would see, and it's important that we take stock of where we really are. So if I could have the first slide, please. So this is Prince Charles. He's been in the news recently, and I know Mike Robinson's going to speak about him. But the thing that I would want to emphasize is that he has a power which is not his, but it's part of an institutional arrangement between the monarchy, the City of London, and Wall Street, clearly, and some other financial centers, the Bank of England, and the MI5, MI6, GCHQ, the intelligence services, and others. I'm not saying they're the only one, but I would say they're probably the core institution for what we refer to as the British Empire. And he has, for 45 years, been directing the formation of what we call the Great Reset, the Green New Deal. Again, he's not the only person, but this is a power center that has an institutional memory and has quite a bit of force behind it. Next one, please. And these are 3 people who we identified a few weeks ago, but just to state again, on the there's Prince Philip, and then in the middle, Prince Bernhard, and then there's Julian Huxley. And they're all extremely important. Prince Philip is the Prince Consort and Charles's father. They decided to use the World Wildlife Fund as a central base of operation for this principle of the British Empire, of the oligarchical model of Babylon. And I'm not saying there are other aren't others that are very important, like the International Union of Conservation of Nature and so forth. But this was one that they used. And let's just see a bit again of what their thinking is. So next one, please. So my screen covers up a little bit of this, but it talks about the genetic stupidity. This is Huxley. Physical weakness, disease proneness, which already exists in this population. My screen covers out a little bit, so I can't read every word. I apologize. Will prove too great a burden for real progress to be achieved. This is Huxley arguing for the return to eugenics. 1 year after the Second World War is ended, and people can tell you there's rubble all throughout Italy, there's rubble throughout Germany. So the reminder of what this 1933-45 experiment was trying to do for population control, but also extermination of peoples, is very alive. But to continue his statement, thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be for UNESCO, which Huxley had formed, become the head of, to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care, and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, so that much that is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable. Next, please. And this is a statement from Prince Philip. I wonder what it would be like to be reincarnated, and my screen is placed in a certain way, as an animal whose species has been so reduced in numbers that it was in danger of extinction. What would its feelings towards the human species whose population explosion had denied it somewhere to exist? I must confess that I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus. And this is his foreword in a book that was written in 1987, If I Were an Animal. He didn't write the book, he wrote the foreword. So what these people did, just in very short order, is that Charles was deployed to the 1992 conference, which was called the Rio Earth Summit. Two features of that: he was one of the people who led that process, having a meeting the year before 1991 on his yacht, Britannia. And just two things, at that conference, among many, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the ones that keep telling us we have global warming, had included man-made and natural causes of global warming. And whatever you want to characterize as global warming, the natural by far outweighs whatever the man-made is. But from that point forward at this conference, they then decided that it was just going to refer to what man-made global warming was and drop the other part, which is the predominant. And the second feature of this is they set up a United Nations framework on convention on climate. And this is what started to put into place the various greenhouse gases and the restrictions that should be put on them. That was finalized in 1997 at the Kyoto conference 5 years later. This was 1992. And those are the ones that we're dealing with today. I would say that this conference was filled with a outlook of literally taking down civilization. And every 5 years you have another conference that's based on this framework, which was then established. The other point I would make, next please. If we could have the next logo. Oh, we can skip that one, please. Yes, that's the Rio Earth Summit. That was event. It was over 100 leaders of nations and 38,000 people. Next, please. And this is the Green New Deal. And the only thing I'll say here, and you can read this in our report, so I don't want to repeat, but the Green New Deal was formed in 2008 by Prince Charles and by two of his closest little green men, as I call them, Charles Port and Tony Juniper. And then it was set up in such a way that it could be exported to the United States. So it wasn't started by Ed Markey, it wasn't started by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, nor Bernie Sanders. It was started by Charles. Next, please. Okay, we can skip that, please. Next, we can skip that. We can go, David, to the next set of slides. So that's just to set the basis of what we are dealing with today. This has been a 75-year process. The first of the slides. Okay, now this is Executive Order 13990, and its title is Executive Order on Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis. This was issued, President Biden became president, was sworn in the afternoon of the 20th of January. This was issued about a few hours later. So this clearly wasn't drawn up on January 20th. It was drawn up most likely during the summer preceding of last year, the summer of 2020. Could have been drawn up 2 years ago. It was something that was drawn up by this crowd that I've identified, and you can include many of the larger and more important banks and speculators and BlackRock and so forth that were involved in this process. It was drawn up with the expectation that it could then start to be implemented very directly. Next, please. I'm going to say something in a second about what is in this. But the good news is that on March 8th, just a few days ago, a suit was brought against this executive order, Biden's Executive Order 13990. And this suit, which was brought by Eric Schmidt and the 11 other attorney generals from states like Iowa and South Dakota, many of the farm states in particular, says that this will inflict trillions of dollars of damage to the U.S. economy for decades to come. It will destroy jobs, stifle energy production, strangle America's energy independence, suppress agriculture, deter innovation, and impoverish working families. And then further, the suit charges that as a result of the implementation of this 13990 executive order, that the U.S. agricultural and energy production, which these actions, which means Biden's executive order, would stifle, have global benefits, which enrich the entire world. And yet the Biden administration gave them little or no weight in its calculation of the social cost of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen oxide. This was filed in the Eastern District of Missouri, as I said, on March 8th. And then afterwards, Schmidt tweeted that Biden's executive order, quote, is a Trojan horse for the Green New Deal. Today we led a coalition to stop it. Missouri is fighting back. And Arkansas has just joined, so that makes 13 states. Now, what is he talking about that's at the heart of this? Well, it's something called if we could go to the next slide, please. It's called social cost of carbon. And this is the way it works. This is from a report on this, the social cost of carbon, the social cost of methane, the social cost of nitrous oxide, and so forth. They use cost-benefit analysis in most government agencies to figure out whether you build something. It's not a smart policy because oftentimes if something is an infrastructure project that has 30 years to be developed, which Alexander Hamilton would have built, which Abraham Lincoln would have built, which Roosevelt would have built, they will say, no, we need returns within the next 2 to 3 years. That doesn't guarantee it. Let's build a baseball stadium or something else instead. But the way this works is the following. They assign the social cost, which we'll see in a second, an alleged social cost, of how much damage can be done by, say, CO2. And if you found that you're pricing CO2 at $50, this is an artificial concept. It's not what you walk into a store and buy CO2. You don't buy it anyway, but it's not that. And you figure out how many tons of CO2, like a power plant or a bridge that use coal processes like cement and steel that were made using energy from a power plant, then you add those costs as a cost. Not just your bricks, not just your mortar, not just your piping, but now this is a cost against global warming. It's a cost because of climate change, rising rivers, shorelines, heat that would burn you up alive. These are all the alleged consequences of global warming, which itself does not exist in any way that is being portrayed. And certainly man's contribution to whatever is going on is negligible. Most of this is cosmic rays, solar rays, and other processes which have been going on for at least a billion years that we know of, and there are historical records on this. But if we can go back to the diagram, so that's added as a cost, And therefore, governments are told, well, this is far too costly. In addition to whatever the prejudice was against infrastructure, now you have laden onto that an additional cost because you're damaging future society. However, if you have something that will decrease emissions, like allegedly, like for example, wind turbines or solar panels or things of that sort, and we saw how well they did in Texas, literally breaking down completely in the part of February, and overloading the system by having to use natural gas and other things to make up the shortage from their breakdown, which could not be done in a way which would avoid blackouts. But if you do that, why, that's a benefit. So therefore, this is a benefit that you get by building those because you're reducing pollution. So naturally, and here's the story, all state governments, all federal agencies, local governments are going to be instructed to use this as an accounting system across the United States. And there will be an attempt to make this applied against also companies that are in this setting. But the thing is, think about this for a second. Let's say you want to build a power station or a flood control, but you're told, well, this is going to happen in Arkansas where they build a lot of rice. You don't need that because that produces a lot of nitrous oxide. So don't build it. In fact, anything that will benefit agriculture will be scarred with the concept that if you build any federal or state project for that area, you are adding social costs of carbon or nitrous oxide and so forth. Next, please. Now, I just want to give people a sense of this because it's a little bit of a different concept, but it's clear enough that some people recognize what it means. Mr. Schmidt's statement in that lawsuit is very strong, and he sees this. So here's what the social costs are. They say that if you use 1 ton additional of carbon, that will cause such damage to the climate that will cost $50 to $100 extra for any project. If you use 1 extra ton of methane, which everybody knows cows and various animals produce when they fart, excuse me, French, that will cost $1,500 extra per ton. If you produce nitrous oxide, that will add $18,000 of per ton to what you have to market coal as your cost. Now, 2 things about this. Below that, I just want to show you the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere is absolutely minuscule, and there is no proof that has ever scientifically that they cause what they're claimed to be causing. Take nitrous oxide. It is 0.00003%. That is, it's 3/100,000ths of a percent. It's not a percent. It's not a tenth of a percent. It's not a thousandth of a percent. It's 3/100,000ths of a percent of the entire gases that we have in the atmosphere. Yet it's supposed to produce various things. One of which is it was supposed to deplete the ozone hole. Scientific America just reported that the Antarctic ozone hole is the smallest it's been since 1988. So that's obviously not the case. It's also supposed to produce acid rain. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, tells you that basically was solved, whether it did it or not, in the 1990s. So, but nonetheless, what's important is that even though most of the nitrous oxide that's produced in agriculture, 60% of it comes from nature, 40% comes from man, from methane, and of course from fertilizer that's used in the soil to make it able to produce a huge amount of food of healthy quality with a fraction of the labor it took us when we were back in 1776 forming this country. So therefore, agriculture will be penalized by having to add $18,000 for every ton of nitrous oxide that's produced, even though that's only 40% of all nitrous oxide, and even though the United States has reduced its nitrous oxide production by over 70% since 1985. All that said, it doesn't exist as a real problem. It's not scientifically proven to cause anything that we know of any significance. It does cause some things It is so small in the atmosphere, it's ridiculous, but this is what's being put through. And so therefore, all the agricultural states figured this out, as did others as well, as people will figure this out as we go forward. And that is at the heart of 13990. It's an attack on agriculture. It's saying that we are going to go back to a more primitive form of agriculture, and we are going to start eliminating agricultural production on a very, very large scale and go to what is called the Lancet diet, which eliminates meat and other things. Next, please. Okay, now this is Executive Order 14008, and this was issued on January 27th, so it's 1 week after President Biden became president. And you may remember for about the first 10 to 14 days, most people did not see President Biden. He was sitting and writing, signing these executive orders at the White House. This was just streaming these out one after another. Now, this one has two features which I think are extraordinarily important, and I'll just mention them. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for that file folder. This order is far more insidious than people really realize. Let me just say what it's going to do. It's going to it directs the National Intelligence, that is the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to report on the security implications of climate change. So it's now shifting climate change into a central policy in every agency, including, of course, our Defense Department and the intelligence services. But it does more than that. It establishes the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy, which is going to have a conference very soon on these very issues, where every governmental agency will take into account the impact of climate and greenhouse gas emissions. It's going to be working on what can be procured, which we just saw in the previous example, which were called the social cost of carbon, the social cost of methane, and the social cost of nitrous oxide. It calls for doubling wind production by 2030. It calls for a federal moratorium on oil and gas development that will be paused on public lands. It calls for elimination of any subsidies or inducements to these areas. It wants to set up a civilian climate corps. Roosevelt set up a civilian conservation corps. We've called for a civilian space corps, which looks to the stars, looks to developing mankind. It's going to set up an environmental justice agency. But another feature of this, just to continue on the agricultural theme, it has a policy called 30 by 30 conservation, which says that we will have to remove 30% of federal lands and 30% of waters from any form of energy development or use for those types of productive purposes. Well, 12% of American land has now been removed in various places. This would take more than double. It would take 2.5 times what we have out of being used for agriculture and other processes. It will do the same for water. And so it's called triple 30. 30% of land would be taken out of use, 30% of water would be taken out of use, and all the marine life and so forth that flows therefrom. Of course, offshore drilling would be nailed on this stuff. You can forget the fossil fuel industry. And it will all be done by 2030. And Marcia Mary Baker writes about this in our report, The Great Step Backward, and points out that what's happening on this is being led in one part by the European Union, which has a program called From Farm to Fork. And that program calls for, and I just would like to cite one feature of that so people get a sense of where they're going. The U.S. Department of Agriculture analyzed the farm to fork policy of the European Union because it's what Biden has in mind for the United States. And that said, according to our U.S. Department of Agriculture, which analyzed it, that in the report, land and agriculture would be cut by 10%, fertilizer use by 20%, pesticide use by 50%, antimicrobials, which are antibiotics which are fed for livestock, would be cut by 50%. So this means you're wiping this out. This is what this is a step for. And the fact that it's putting climate change at the center of strategic policy in every department of the United States, including our military, tells you that this is a profound shift. This is not just an addition or onto one thing or another. It's simply a change in what the direction of the United States is going to be doing. Almost none of this was publicized during the campaign. You didn't hear about these things, but they're being rolled out right now. And this is the core of the Green New Deal, which you heard about from Julian Huxley. Next, please. Okay, this is the last thing I want to feature. This is called Making Mission Possible. And you can see that's the cover of about an 80-page report. And it's called the Energy Transitions Commission. The key person here is a guy named Lord Nicholas Stern. Stern put out a report around 2006, 2007, which called for a complete change of the world based on reducing CO2 emissions and decarbonization. Prince Charles praised that in 2006, pushed this in 2008, and then he and Prince Charles got together in 2015, where they were both together, they were photographed together, to help develop in Paris in November of that year what's called COP21, which is the Paris Accord, which President Biden just took us back into, which is a hideous accord. So he is definitely in the circles of Prince Charles. There's many other sides to this. Next, please. Thank you. Now, what they do is they target hard to abate industries in this report. And they target aluminum, steel, cement. They also target plastics and other things. And what they say is that these, and this whole report, by the way, is based on the fact that by 2040, the world, according to the International Energy Agency, would have about 567 trillion joules of energy supply. And they cite an alternative which would reduce that by 30%, down to 398 trillion joules. What does that mean? They're called exajoules. What does that mean? It means that they want a level far below where it should go, touched by natural growth. If we were to develop Africa, if we were to develop America, if we were to start building the nuclear power plants, the fission processes, way expanding our missions to Mars, if we were to do those things, we would be far beyond even what a moderate rate of growth would be. They actually have a level for 2040, which is below where it is right now. So if you have any doubts about where energy is going, this should dispel it. So they tackle aluminum, steel, and cement, saying it's very hard for them to reduce these uses of carbon. So we're going to work on that, but they have to reduce the carbon. Well, they don't have any solutions. So you can figure out what's going to happen. These are going to be wiped out. Now, I want to just show you what the uses of aluminum, steel, and cement are. We've dealt with agriculture. I want you to see what's going to happen in industry. Okay, aluminum, power lines, high-rise buildings, aircraft components, spacecraft components, ships, trains, bridges, personal vehicles, and of course, all the household appliances you know of. This is critical, but aluminum uses a lot of electricity, and they're going to tell you that that electricity either emits CO2 or N2O, which is nitrous oxide, or various other things like that, so you can't have it. Next, please. This is cement. Well, think about it. What do you see cement in? Roads, dams, bridges, tunnels, culverts, shipping ports, airports, water pipe type floors, precast pipe for manufacturing, all infrastructure. Every single feature of infrastructure in the United States and in the world comes from the use of cement, which we'll get to in a second. And last, next, please. Steel. What does that go into? Roads, dams, bridges, tunnels, culverts, machine tools, stamping and forging machines, electric generators, turbines, transformers, tractors, reapers, harvesters, office buildings, railroads, locomotives, and all throughout your residential homes. Now, what is this then? Why are they calling for this to effectively be shut down? They're just saying, we want to reduce the energy, but if they can't get rid of their CO2, that's not acceptable, so that means we're getting rid of this. If an economy, take LaRouche's concept of an economy is an integrated feature. It's not where we build a little something here, we throw up a hut there. You have different processes which are necessary as a whole to raise mankind's relative potential population density, which means especially increasing the cognitive potential of man and making breakthroughs to next levels of development. If you took those three elements by themselves out, you could not build infrastructure, you would not have manufacturing, you would not have agricultural implements. And if you take away the land, what do you have? You have the complete takedown of the agro-manufacturing republic, which was created in America as an expression, as Lynn said earlier, of Louis XI and Henry VII and so forth. This is what the plan is. It's the plan that Julian Huxley was talking about. And the feature is that, just to put it positively, and then you can see what the negative is. When you go from wood burning to coal and the fossil fuels, oil, gas, you go up 2 orders of magnitude in energy flux density. When you go from coal and so forth up to nuclear fission and fusion, you're going up 10 to the 5th power in joules per gram, energy flux density. When you do that, you don't just change one feature or another feature. You change the entirety of how that economy works as a process and its embedded potential for even greater anti-entropic growth. What this plan is to go the opposite way, to take you down by taking out steel, by taking out aluminum, by taking out everything that's vital for existence, and make impossible any future generation. And they're saying we're not even going to have as much energy in 20 years as we have today. Now, the point about this is that this is what we're looking into. If you combine this with the biggest financial blowout in 400 years, if you combine this with a threat to push for nuclear war by those British forces that see the only way that they may be able to stop China and Russia is to ignite a war which would take down most of the world, which they believe, as long as we can survive it one way or another, will rebuild. So if you take those two elements of insanity and this policy, which I've just shown, you won't have existence. Next, please. Okay. If you take out 30%, and there's a guy named Woolley who wants to take out 50% of the land, we're going back to what Africa was. Now, this is Africa in 1994. So this is expanded. But if you see those little patches, those are wildlife reserves, where, by the way, many things went on which were not to protect animals at all. And you can see that you have entire portions of Africa where you could not build something because of those reserves. Now, those have since expanded in size greatly under the World Wildlife Fund, Prince Philip and others. But now think of America having 30 to 50% of those reserves. This is the colonialization of America. This is how the oligarchy lives. Next, please. Now, what's actually going on? And this is a strategic bombing survey. You keep hearing environmental this and environmental that. I mentioned briefly that nitrous oxide is not causing acid rain, and even if it had in the beginning, it's now stated that that's not an issue, nor is it opening an ozone hole over the Antarctic. And people who are pushing this policy know that. They don't care. When, during World War II, and this is true for every nation, you set up an Office of Economic Warfare, and the Office of Economic Warfare looks at a country that it wants to fight, or doesn't want to necessarily, but is in a war with, like us with Nazi Germany. And you had to figure out, if I wanted to knock them out, I just don't drop bombs on citizens unendingly. What you do is you figure out, where are their power plants? Where are their dams? Where are their water supplies? Where are their electricity supplies? Where do they make aluminum, which is critical for aircraft? Where do they make other things which are essential for food? Ball bearings seems like a small thing, critical for industry. Machine tools, critical for industry. And you bomb it. You simply take it out of existence. And you lessen the ability of the enemy to fight. That's what's being done here in the United States. It's a strategic bombing survey. This is taken of Osaka which was not Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so it wasn't hit by the nuclear bombs, but we were bombing it. And you can see all the little marks. They're analyzing what they did the next day of how effective this was. This has zero to do with the environment. And the last thing I just want to say is the way this was put together for the last 75 years is, what do we have to knock out? This is the thinking of the oligarchs. This is the thinking, of John Schellenhuber. This is the thinking of Prince Charles. What do we have to knock out? And then we'll invent an excuse afterwards. Acid rain, throw it in afterwards. But you first select the targets that you want to knock out, like certain politicians who you want to knock out, and then you invent the scandal afterwards. This is happening far faster. I will just say, in terms of coal-fired plants, we have shut down, the United States has had shut down 229 over the last decade, and we only have 241 left. And we've gone from 2 gigawatts to 1 gigawatt of coal-fired plant electricity. This is before Biden came in. So we have a tremendous job. The fighting spirit of some of the attorney generals is very inspiring, but we have to reach everyone. And we can't assume that this is just a design, the Green New Deal, the Great Reset. It's terrible, but it's off in the future. Another year, another 2 years, and it's going to get bad. No, it is being implemented. This farm to fork policy, the EU is going to come back with a policy statement in 45 days. That's it, a month and a half. Many of these things are being done in a month and a half or 2. They're not even open for public criticism yet, which is amazing. We're being ruled by executive decrees, essentially. And I would urge people to show up next week and bring at least one friend or 2 to our conference to get this report that we've produced and get it out to people, get it to different people. We've got loads of congressmen and others that we want to, and diplomats and so forth, that we need to get this to. And this is that fight that can win. We can absolutely win this, but those are the terms of it.
Thank you very much, Richard. Let me just say that the Great Leap Backward, LaRouche Exposes the Great Reset, is available for purchase from Executive Intelligence Review. And we want to make sure that all of you not only get that, but understand that the circulation of this may very well work depending on how widely we were to actually distribute this, in the same way that Thomas Paine's common sense worked. You have to create a circumstance in the United States where people go beyond partisanship and realize that their very existence is at stake. So we're going to go now to Harley Schlanger and see what Harley has to tell us about the international, both not merely implications, but also, more importantly, the combination of strategic forces actually available in the world, including us, to fight this process. So Harley?
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Richie, for your presentation. Where Richie went through the economic and energy component of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, I'm going to focus on the military strategic. And for those of you who saw my presentation last week, I spoke about this doctrine called geopolitics. The geopolitics was actually thought up as a strategy to carry out precisely the kind of end effects that Richie was talking about: the destruction of nations, the inability of nations to defend their population, the breakup of alliances, so there'll never be alliances that would be able to combat these kinds of policies. That's what geopolitics was seen as developed by Halford Mackinder, the person who's credited with developing modern geopolitics as a strategy. And as I pointed out, his theory was actually applied in the 20th century, which led to World War I and World War II. It was responsible for the policies of the Cold War, and then brought up again with the new Cold War after the collapse of the Soviet Union, through such institutions as the Project for a New American Century, groups such as the Atlantic Council, the Henry Jackson Society, and others. Now, Let me start by quoting for you some comments from leading military officials about what would happen if the United States ends up in a war with China. There was a war game last fall, which is conducted almost every year, to look at what would happen if there was a battle between US forces and Chinese forces in the so-called Indo-Pacific region, that is in the Pacific area, where the United States has a strategy defined by something called air-sea battle, which includes fixed positions on islands. It includes the use of military naval vessels and long-range air operations. What would happen in a war 10 years from now with China? And what the war game showed is that, first of all, the Chinese would use a military exercise as a cover. There are military exercises all the time. There were just recently some overflights over Taiwan, which really stirred the concern with the US military that the Chinese might actually be using this as a cover. But what this war game scenario showed is that they use the military exercise as a cover, but then launch a bioweapon attack on US bases and warships throughout the Pacific, followed by missile strikes and airstrikes on those same US positions, followed by an air and amphibious attack on Taiwan. These war game results were classified, but there was an interview given with the Air Force Lieutenant General S. Clinton Hinote, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategy, Integration, and Requirements, which was just recently released by Yahoo News Service. And here's what he said about the war game. He said, China is building an effective counter capability to the US strategy. He said they're building it systematically, and the US military considers it highly effective. He said the trend in the war games now, and this is his quote, is not just we were losing, but we were losing faster. In other words, that the Chinese are developing capabilities that we cannot keep up with. And so he reported that he was there at a meeting with the Air Force Secretary and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, where the person who ran the war game gave a report. And here's what he said. We should never play this war game scenario again, because we know what is going to happen. And he said the alternative is that the US military must change course. Now, did any of them ever think that maybe we should try cooperation and diplomacy to avoid the possibility of a war? Did any of them think that using US deployments into the South China Sea and continued buildup with new weapon systems going into Taiwan would be seen by the Chinese as the kind of threat which would require them to build up their defensive capability? Well, obviously not, if you look at what's come up since then. Now, as a result of these losses in war games, there was a change in the US national security doctrine. In 2018, the National Defense Strategy identified Russia and China as the primary challenge and adversaries that we must be prepared to fight, not international terror, but Russia and China. Now, this was brought up in a Senate Armed Services Committee testimony last week by Admiral Philip Davidson, who said that China could invade Taiwan in the next 6 years. And he said our conventional deterrent is rapidly, or actually eroding in the region. He went on to say that we need an extra $4.7 billion in 2022. And of course, if you know what the military-industrial complex is, these war scenarios are necessary for them to demand more funds. That's a big part of this operation. And it's so obvious I won't even discuss it much, but we can take it up in the question and answer if you wish. Here's what Davidson said we need. We need more missile defense systems. We need more ground-based offensive missiles, which means we need more bases. We need to spread them out more effectively so we're not stuck in the existing places. But he said without deployment of these weapon systems, China will become more aggressive, with options including an invasion of Taiwan or an attack on Guam. Now, one might ask, why would China become less aggressive if we put in these systems? If they see it as a threat, wouldn't they go for a bigger buildup? But that's what they call military intelligence, and why they say that's an oxymoron. Now, here's the rest of his comment. In stark contrast to our free and open vision, the Communist Party of China promotes a closed and an authoritarian system through internal oppression and external aggression. China's pernicious approach to the region includes a whole-of-party effort to coerce, corrupt, and collapse governments, businesses, organizations, and the people of the Indo-Pacific. The military balance in the Indo-Pacific is becoming more unfavorable for the United States and our allies. With this imbalance, we are accumulating risk that may embolden China to unilaterally change the status quo before our forces may be able to deliver an effective response. The greatest danger the United States and our allies face in the region is the erosion of conventional deterrence vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. That's from the commander of the, what is his position? The commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific region. So it's an open call for an escalation of military buildup, supposedly to prevent an attack. Now, this was also a major theme of a document that was released by the Biden administration on March 3rd, called the Interim National Security Strategic Guidance. And in this paper, it once again called Russia and China as the growing threats to Western democracies. And it states that the administration will endeavor to gather the world's democracies into an alliance against Russia and China to counter their aggressive military deployment and thwart their malign influence on the world. Now, I'll say more about this strategy doctrine guidance paper in a moment, but think about this. Who's deployed military forces throughout the world destabilizing governments and regions? The United States. We have bases in somewhere between 80 and 100 countries. We have military everywhere in the world. We are conducting regime change operations everywhere in the world. Who's been collapsing governments? Who's been spending funds to build up regime change? It's been the United States. Now, in this context, then, you have to look at what happened yesterday with what was called the Quad meeting, a virtual meeting which included Biden, Modi of India, Prime Minister Morrison of Australia, and Prime Minister Suga of Japan. Now, the Quad is what is sometimes called Asian NATO, India, Australia, and Japan, plus the United States. And the argument is that we need to build up a more effective deterrent to Chinese aggression. The ostensible topic of the meeting yesterday, the virtual meeting, was vaccine diplomacy, which sounds fine. And they discussed how to provide more vaccines to deal with the pandemic for the peoples of Asia, the so-called Indo-Pacific region. Now, this was part of a diplomatic effort, they said, which would be an assertion of a mutual commitment to a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. The cooperation on vaccines includes what? Well, building up in particular Indian production, because the Indians have a capability for pharmaceutical manufacture. So build up India's production. This is the sweetener for India. Using US technology, money from the US and Japan, and Australian logistics and support to make sure the vaccines are delivered. Now, the underlying unspoken message, and actually I think it was spoken a little bit, but not much, is that China is using its vaccine to offer it to countries all over Asia and Africa. The Chinese vaccine is considered very effective, and the Chinese are gearing up manufacture to make it available to countries that can't afford to produce it on their own. And so what we're seeing is using the pandemic as a way of building a military alliance, as opposed to actually just doing some good. Now, they also discussed climate change and technology. And on climate change, the Pentagon announced yesterday a working group on climate, which will look at the threats to U.S. Security coming from climate problems. Now, what's the military going to do to stop if, in fact, the waters are going to rise and flood Florida? What's the military going to do? Well, actually, what they're talking about is they're going to blame China as the most inefficient, largest carbon producer, when the Chinese approach is to move to the higher temperature burning processes to produce electricity, namely clean coal and nuclear, which will make up most of China's electricity production in 2030. So they're not going along with the Green New Deal. So from this standpoint, that's a military security threat to the United States. And on the technology cooperation, it's to build up an alternative to semiconductors, chips, and other products that are needed for computers that at this point, the United States is dependent largely on China to produce. Now, what does this whole idea of the Quad really represent? Well, this is classic British geopolitics. First of all, India and Australia are part of the British Commonwealth. Australia is part of the Five Eyes, so it's directly integrated into the military intelligence policy of the United Kingdom. But India and Australia are members of the Commonwealth, and that's what they're using to pull India into an alliance against China. Japan historically has been a center of operations for the British. One of the most famous examples is the British financing of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, which was designed to weaken Russia so that Russia would be forced to ally with England and stop impinging on the British Empire through Afghanistan into the Indian subcontinent. And the US is involved because the US is under British geopolitical direction. So what is the Quad? Well, this is also covered in the Pentagon statements, what their intent is. The comments were put out announcing this meeting, the Biden meeting, and also the upcoming meetings of General Austin, or Defense Secretary Austin and Blinken, with Japan, and I believe he's meeting with Japan and India. What they're saying is the State Department will highlight cooperation that promotes peace, security, and cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region and around the world. So what is the content of this? Well, the idea of the Quad began in 2004 when those four nations, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, joined together in a relief effort after the devastating tsunami hit Indonesia. It was primarily an effort at giving support to Indonesia and providing material and logistical backup to deal with that horrible event. But it wasn't at that point necessarily meant as a military alliance. But in 2007, Vice President Dick Cheney called on then Japanese Prime Minister to join him in making this a military alliance. As Cheney was wont to do. Cheney was part of the product of the grouping from the Project for a New American Century, which asserted that the United States must be the unilateral power determining policy in the war after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. A think tank called the Center for New American Strategy was set up, which was the successor to PNAC. PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, was discredited by its buildup for the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, because that was a product of people like Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, and Cheney, saying that this was necessary for the US to assert its authority. But it became discredited because they used lies, fake intelligence, the so-called weapons of mass destruction, and had no exit strategy, no plan to win a war. In fact, they destroyed the country of Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. So PNAC was put out of business, but they set up this new Center for New American Strategy. And this center put out a report in 2008, which called for increased American engagement in Asia. And it argued that in the 21st century, America's strategic preoccupation in Iraq and Afghanistan is undermining its ability to adapt to major power shifts in the Asia Pacific that are actively challenging America's traditional balance of power role in the region. Now, no mention was made of the fact that the preoccupation in Iraq and Afghanistan was the product of the same network, which is now saying we have to turn to Asia. And the leading officials in both parties spoke eloquently about this. We have to take this up. We have to make this a product of American policy. And in the 2008 presidential campaign, Obama gave a speech where he called for a new worldwide concert of democracies to come together to counter Russian and Chinese influence. This is the background to Obama's pivot to Asia. Now, the concept of a pivot directly comes from Mackinder and British geopolitics, with the pivot being the areas that have to be kept under imperial control in order to sustain the power of the empire. And the pivots include Asia and Eurasia, the Eurasian heartland. And that specifically, it also included the Ottoman Empire collapse. What do you do in the Middle East? So one of the pivots today is the whole Southwest Asia region. The other is now the Indo-Pacific. And what they argued is that this is where we have to prepare for the next confrontations. So in 2010, they developed the Air-Sea Battle Doctrine, which was an operational plan for military deployment against China. The economic warfare component of the pivot was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a free trade agreement which was finalized in 2015 under Obama. This is what Hillary Clinton called the gold standard of free trade agreements, and was, by the way, one of the first actions of President Trump was to pull us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, along with pulling us out of the Paris Climate Accord. But what Obama said of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is that the TPP allows America, and not countries like China, to write the rules of the road in the 21st century. Now, the TPP was exclusionary. It didn't include China, which is the US's largest trade partner in Asia. How would you have a free trade agreement in a region and leave out your leading trade partner? Well, in response, the Chinese invited the United States to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to be a partner in investing in infrastructure throughout South Asia. The Obama administration not only declined to do that, but vigorously lobbied others, including the United Kingdom and Japan, not to join with them. So you come back to the strategic doctrine paper. What was the intent of these various policy changes? And it's in my notes here somewhere. The idea of this Asia pivot, the idea of the Quad, includes the extension of NATO into the Indo-Pacific region. And this is something that's being discussed in Europe constantly, put forward by the people who are having trouble delivering vaccines to countries who can't provide for infrastructure to any country in Europe. They're shutting down programs to build bridges and canals, and they're engaging in economic warfare against Russia and China. But they're talking about sending troops to the Indo-Pacific. The British are talking about a couple of a carrier group, but they had problems because it was leaking and had to go back to be repaired. And the Germans are talking about sending one frigate. This is the great extent of NATO expansion to the Far East. But in the new strategic doctrine paper, It asserts our democratic alliances enable us to present a common front, produce a unified vision, and pool our strength to promote standards, establish effective international rules, and hold countries like China to account. That is why we will reaffirm, invest in, and modernize NATO and our alliances with Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. And I want to read you just one quote from Anton Blinken, the US Secretary of State, who will be meeting with Chinese officials along with his National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on March 18th. There'll be a meeting in Anchorage, Alaska. What Blinken told the congressional hearings the other day, that the issue is who will write the rules, who will defend the rules-based order. And he said that we have to gather the democracies of the world together. And he said our strategic vision is to do that, to pull together the democracies. And this is incorporated in a concept called the D10, the Democratic 10, to expand the G7 to include, I believe it's South Korea, Australia, and India, to, again, counter China and Russia. So this is part of the containment and encirclement plan. So what is it we're looking at here? Well, as they're moving through the fraud of climate change to destroy the world economies and put sovereign nation states under a central banker's dictatorship, in which global corporate cartels in finance, in insurance, in big pharma, raw materials, will dictate the terms of trade of investment, which means no investment will go to physical production. It will only go into the speculative bubbles. And in order to keep the peace, we will have these military alliances. And in order to make that work, we have to contain Russia and China and carry out regime change against them. That's the military strategic deployment of British geopolitics, to defend an economic financial order which is collapsing, but which is bent on a policy, committed to a policy of financial regime change. And this is what the fight is in the United States right now. Now, Joe Biden made a comment at the Munich Security Conference in mid-February, where he said, we do not want to pit East against West. We don't want to have a new Cold War. But the language, the deployment, and the overall intention of building up this alliance in the Pacific, at the same time issuing new sanctions against Russia for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and for the so-called solar winds hack, which there's no evidence that it happened, tells a different story. That's why our conference, the subtitle of our conference, is 2 months into the new administration. What will the policies be? And most importantly, what can you do to have an effect on what America's policy will be? Can we prevent a British geopolitical doctrine, which led to the 2 world wars in the last century? Can we prevent it from leading us to a new world war in the immediate future?
Okay, thank you very much, Harley. Obviously, we've gotten now 2 rather comprehensive reports on the truth behind the hoax of the Green New Deal, which has nothing to do, as you've just heard, with environment at all, but has to do with the age-old battle of monetarism and oligarchism against the Republican principle. As was outlined by Lynn and LaRouche at the beginning of the broadcast, maybe some did not see that, and we would advise that you just take a look at the full broadcast of today at the conclusion. What we're going to do to actually get ourselves started, we have a couple of questions, and but we have also a short update from British journalist Mike Robinson, who joined us here a couple of weeks ago. So he's filed a short update and political primer on the recent goings-on involving the Crown. Take a look.
I think it's important to understand that the monarchy and the civil service in the UK are not left or right. There is no left or right with respect to them. That's something that happens on the streets with political parties. But when political parties end up in government and in power, in inverted commas, they inevitably find themselves actually staring a longer term policy in the face. And so, historically over the last 40, 50 years, you look at government after government after government, they're Labour or they're Conservative or whatever, they're supposed to be on the left, they're supposed to be on the right, but the policies continue as if nobody was there at all. So we've got to always keep in mind that left and right politics don't apply at that level in this country, at least. The royal family is a business. There's no question about that. And so they are involved in various things. For example, Prince Charles is Duke of Cornwall. He receives all the income from the farming estates in Cornwall, which is a county in the very southwest of England. The family receives money from many other sources other than the so-called civil list, the government funding of the royal family. So something that many people don't realize is that the Crown, the royal family, effectively owns the entire coastline of the UK, and therefore, with the push for green energy and the push for wind turbines, and particularly in the UK, the push for offshore wind turbines, the royal family receives significant, I'm talking about hundreds of millions of pounds a year in effectively rent money for the seabed that the wind turbines are installed on. Some of the money from that rental goes to the government, to the treasury, but I think it's 75% of it goes to the royal family. So, it is a business. And the hierarchy on the business side is Prince Philip at the top. Prince Charles is second in command at the moment, although that may change. Prince William is very much, it appears that Prince William is his father's son. He is obviously next in line following Charles for the throne, and therefore he's part of in the main line of the succession. And so he is definitely playing the family game. Harry, being that 1 degree removed from the succession, seems to not. And maybe there's. I think he took the death of his mother a lot harder than William did, and I think he is somewhat less. He's more distant from Charles than William is. I think there's no question about that. I do think Harry. I think it's pretty clear from what he said in the past that he to some degree feels that the royal family was responsible for his mother's death, and so that perhaps explains his willingness to be quite so outspoken. But it's interesting today, Dennis, that the latest. The comment that Meghan made about or at least the allegation of racism is getting some traction now. So the French magazine Charlie Hebdo has just published a new issue which has the Queen kneeling on Meghan's neck, and the headline is "Why Meghan Left Buckingham Palace." And she is saying, "Because I couldn't breathe." So it's already being used in a very political way in many places. Then, because of course the monarchy is an institution, it's notionally the monarch is the head of state, but the monarch is supposed to fulfill a constitutional role in the sense that legislation is introduced into Parliament. It goes through the House of Commons. There are amendments made. It then goes to the House of Lords. There are more amendments made. It comes back to the House of Commons, and eventually it gets passed or otherwise. And then at that point, it goes for what's called royal assent. Royal assent is supposed to be a process where the monarch of the day has the opportunity to assess whether a piece of legislation fits with the laws and customs of the country. Is she supposed to represent the people in this? That's the oath that she takes or he takes whenever at the coronation. But that royal assent process hasn't happened for, I mean, I think it's the last time it happened was Queen Anne, so that was early 1700s. So the monarch doesn't actually take any role in the running in the governance of the country. However, there's a secondary aspect to this, and it's not royal assent. It's called Queen's consent or King's consent if there's a king. And this is where the royal family, not the crown, the royal family gets the opportunity to look at any legislation which is before it is introduced into Parliament, and suggest, we'll say suggest in inverted commas, amendments if necessary. In other words, they get the opportunity to see whether any legislation which is being introduced to Parliament may impact them as an organisation, and they get the opportunity to mitigate any impact that may have, which effectively puts them above the law. Now, you asked about the City of London. It's a similar situation there. The City of London has a lobbyist in Parliament all the time called the Remembrancer. And that person is there to represent the interests of the City of London in Parliament. So any legislation that goes into Parliament, they get the opportunity to make their feelings known there as well. So there are multiple institutions that represent oligarchs and oligarchy, that have an opportunity to interfere in the so-called democratic process in the UK. The furore around Meghan and these types of popcorn journalists, don't really think we should be worrying too much about them, because it is soap opera stuff. It's not real. And it's also diversionary, and of course, in the public mind, when the public sees this kind of thing going on, and they're being presented with this by journalists, and they're being presented with this controversy, and it's being made to be a soap opera like thing, then of course people aren't looking at what else is going on. They're not looking at what the royal family, what their business interests are, what influence they have on government. They're not looking at those kind of things, and they're not actually looking objectively at what the royal family is. I mean, it is a business, as we said at the beginning, and if people understood that the Prince Charles, and Prince William, by the way, has said in the last couple of weeks that he's going to be taking over many of Prince Charles' environmental campaigning roles. But if when we've got the situation that Prince Charles is pushing so hard for the Great Reset and for green energy production, when he has a vested interest in seeing wind turbines planted, in the foreshore, there's a massive conflict of interest there, and people aren't really aware of that because they're focused on this soap opera that's going on.
So I want to first see if there's any response that either Richard you have or Harley you have to what you just heard from Mike, and then we'll go to questions. Again, I guess we should post again. I guess that's at questions at LaRouche organization dot whatever. So if you put that up again, Dave, just so people know. I've gotten a couple, but we don't have Diane, who often is fielding these questions. So let me simply ask if either of you have a response to what you just heard. Richie, why don't you start with you first?
Yeah, I do. I'll keep it limited for now because there's many aspects of it, of which what Mike said is correct. I think it's a little bit broader than what Mike said. You have to realize that this family, and we're pulling stuff together on this, is the wealthiest family in the world in terms of tangible assets, that is not financial paper. One publication in Britain, I looked at the stuff to try and make sure that you don't overstate or understate, put their physical assets at $35 billion. That includes things like castles. They own 24 castles and royal residences. And these are gigantic. You see the changing of the guard in Buckingham Palace. What you don't realize is that this has 776 rooms, and it's maintained. The way it's maintained is it's an international force, and that's what I want to emphasize. But let me just mention Windsor Castle, and you'll get a sense of this and the connection between the monarchy and the City of London. Windsor Castle was started. Well, what happened is you have this 1066, and you have the Norman invasion, and the person who led it, at least nominally, was William the Conqueror, who became king in December of 1066, and he began building Windsor Castle as a fortress in 1070 and completed in 1086 or 87. This castle is the largest continuous fort, and it's also the largest home in the world. You have rooms there, like this, the green room, just as an example, that's not only has green carpets and green chairs with brocade and so forth, inlaid in the walls are marble and gold. But and you have room after room after room like that. They just say casually, there's 1,000 rooms in this castle. It's got 453,000 square feet of space. But this arrangement and their acquisitions, I would just say, think of what Lyndon LaRouche constantly talked about. It's the Babylonian model of oligarchy, in which you assume a tremendous mass of wealth far beyond what you have. I mean, Buckingham Palace has 58 royal bedrooms. I mean, how many places can you sleep in one night? I mean, you just can't. But why did he do it? Because it's this principle, which Helga's been emphasizing, of you have 1 to 3% of the population who are either the rulers and or they're people who are the financiers, or a priestly class, which is usurious. And the rest of the population is in status of serfs, it's in status of peasant class, and servants. And that principle, which lands through Venice by way of Amsterdam into Britain, has a tremendously important history. That's what they look for. It's to perpetuate not just their wealth. And again, this is in terms of tangible wealth. I mean, it's true that Bezos of Amazon has 191 billion. 90% or more of that's in paper, which will go very, very quickly and turn into ashes during a financial crisis. The monarchy also has an institutional memory, but this is an international force. I'll just give you one example. The reason I mentioned William the Conqueror. When William the Conqueror gets to the city of London, which was just this walled 1 square mile, in 1066, he strikes a deal. There's another part, Westminster and other things, which he just leveled to the ground. He was a barbarian, cruel, everything you can say. But he gives them an agreement that I will not take down your walls. And he gives them a terms of agreement. But they have a certain special relationship to the monarchy. Today, and I won't go more into this, but today, the city of London, they run themselves through these ridiculous guilds, the fishmonger guilds of this guild. When you look at them, every one of those guilds has a patron, and every one of those patrons is a member of the monarchy. Now, the city of London is not just a financier place, it is. It's also the center of world money laundering. It's the center of world derivatives. It's the center of the world drug trade. It's the center of world financing of terrorism. All of those things. And if you read a book called Treasure Island, you'll see some of that stuff. It's quite remarkable. And this is an institution, along with the Bank of England, which was created in 1694, and the intelligence services form a quartet. And it's extremely important. I think one thing that the thing with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry show is that this, of course, is a totally racist institution. But think of this. The idea of race science did not develop with the Harrimans, Mary Harriman and her children, Roland and Avril. It didn't develop with Dr. Alfred Rosenberg, who was worked with Hitler to form the Nazi Party beginning 1919 in Bavaria. It's the oligarchy. They believe that they rule through blood. Do they believe that it's divine right of kings? I don't know. But they definitely believe that they rule through blood. That's where it comes from. That's where environmentalism comes from. That's where Malthusianism comes from, where they don't believe most people are fit to live. And then they dress it up with, well, food grows arithmetically and people grow geometrically. But that's a cover for this conception of the world which we have to eliminate. And I would say if people ask about this, and I mean, I'm not trying to make Harry and Meghan into great people. They have their own side of things. But that is very, very clear. If people ask, what about this? What do you know about this? We'll say, well, that's funny you should ask. We have a special report. It's called The Great Leap Backwards. And it tells you that not just that they treat individuals like this, they want to eliminate 2 to 4 billion people in this world through the Great Recess. We got the real story. You want to the real story on this thing? There's a certain side thing, as you know, Mike said, popcorn journalism. But this is the story. And we've got to eliminate that nest of vipers and evil people and that whole system, system.
Okay, so Harley, you may have a response on that, and I also have a question for you after you answer.
Well, I'll be fairly brief. I mean, I think what we're seeing is something that's not so unusual, which is a restructuring or a reshaping of the idea of the British Empire, which has happened in the past. What is going on now is, look, we're facing a systemic financial disintegration. And as Richie just pointed out, they have a lot of resources, a lot of wealth. There's a reason Prince Charles is standing side by side with the Davos crowd in implementing the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. There is a power in the financial holdings and also in the intelligence operations that are run by the British Empire. Keep in mind that MI5 and MI6 answer to the monarchy, to the royal family, not to the parliament. And so what you're dealing with here is something that is trying to reconfigure itself, whether it's Charles, whether it's William. We go back to what Lord Palmerston said. The British have no permanent friends or allies, only permanent interests. And they're going to do whatever it takes to protect those interests. And I think, whatever the restructuring is, whether it's going to be pushing Charles aside and bringing in William, or however they do the changeover. One of the things Lyndon LaRouche said years ago is that the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, may be the last full monarch of the British Empire, that there's going to be a change. So we'll see what happens with this. I think avoid the circus and look at the policy that we've laid out here today as to what they're trying to do.
Okay, so there's a question to you, Harley, from New York, which is, what would it take for China and Russia to say that the attempt to impose the Great Reset on the world would lead to war? Would such a statement be helpful or harmful at this point?
Well, I think the Chinese and the Russians have been saying that in a variety of ways. Certainly, Lavrov has been, the Russian foreign minister has been very clear that the sanctions policy, the attempt to cancel Nord Stream 2, the provocations going on in the Middle East, all of these things he's been pointing to as a real danger. Putin himself, with his emphasis, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has pointed out, Putin's whole history of the buildup to World War II was an intent to essentially say these kinds of manipulations do lead to war. And he said that both to prepare the Russian people for it, but also to say, look, let's step back from this. Let's not sleepwalk into this war. And if you look at the editorials in Global Times and some of the Chinese official publications, some of the speeches, what the Chinese are saying now to Biden is, look, let's take this opportunity to step back from the confrontation that we've had, largely as a result of the rude and dangerous blatherings of Mike Pompeo. Let's step back and look at what our common interests are. And that's what they're hoping will be the basis of the discussion next week in Anchorage. But at the same time, they're telling their population that they are not going to tolerate interference with their internal affairs, whether it's in Hong Kong or whether it's in the South China Sea. So I think they're very explicit on this. If you actually read the speeches of President Xi of China and President Putin of Russia, you find something interesting. If you read their speeches at Davos, Putin essentially said, we're not going to go along with the Great Reset or the Green New Deal. And while Xi paid lip service to the idea that we have to clean the environment and China's working on this, well, they are. But they're doing it the way LaRouche specified, by increasing the energy flux density of their power generation, as opposed to reducing the energy flux density. They're using science to go in that direction. Now, the reason this is so important is that you have many Americans who still are caught in the McCarthyism of the post-World War II period against Russia, or the anti-China sentiment that's been drummed up since March 2020 against China on COVID, who are saying these are our enemies, they're the force that we're going to have to fight in the future. Why don't you take a look and realize that they are our real allies? They're the allies. If we wish to go back to our status, our tradition, as an industrial republic committed to scientific and technological advance and sharing that with the world, well, Russia and China have a similar outlook as two other sovereign republics. And so who wants a war between Russia and China against the United States? It's the globalists who are trying to keep us from putting their bankrupt system through bankruptcy reorganization. So I think the whole question of Russia and China is fascinating. It's a hard thing to get across because there's so much propaganda. But I'll make one other quick point on this. There are many people who are supporters of President Trump who recognize that the media lied for 4 years against the president, especially when it came to Russiagate. And yet they now believe the media that China is somehow a threat to us. They believe this idea that Russia is hacking into our systems. Why would you believe that when you see what they did to the president? The same people who were trying to run regime change in the United States, including the George Soros network, including the British intelligence services that produced Christopher Steele and so on, that produced the regime changes throughout the world and that destabilized Southwest Asia and led to the refugee crisis in Europe and so on. The same people behind that are the ones who are telling us we have to prepare for war with Russia and China. Instead, what do we have to lose by having a summit, sitting down and talking about the areas of common interest, such as fighting the pandemic, ending poverty, curing disease, and so on, scientific advance, space exploration, and from that standpoint, then address the areas where we have disagreements. And I think that's the point I would make on that.
Okay, this question is from Kynan, and it's for Richard. He says, Mr. Freeman, you gave a very comprehensive report on the Green New Deal and its intention to destroy global industry, manufacturing, and agriculture. I often find that the hardest idea to disprove when talking to my friends and family about the consequences of adopting a global Green New Deal is that the human population has a limited carrying capacity and cannot exceed a certain amount. How did Lyndon LaRouche prove that there are no limits to growth, and what do you think is the maximum population density that the Earth can support?
Well, it's a good question, Kynan. And I think I would say there's one book which you've probably already read that has exactly that title, There Are No Limits to Growth. And he does a wonderful job of that. But I think the one way to do this, you can prove all the resources that man can develop, and that's very, very important. You really, and that's important, and one should do it. Look, I mean, let me just say one thing on this. If we had taken, we've had now almost $6 trillion in 3 stimulus packages over the last 12 months, 13 months. If we had taken out of that, I believe 100 to 150 billion and put aside institution like ones that were created like under the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that had a Defense Plant Corporation. If we created one of those for fusion and just blitz the process, whether we're talking about tokamak, magnetic, or whether we're talking about inertial confinement and various other things. We do the same thing with setting up a corporation which provides credit and directions and also takes down some of the restrictions for building things for nuclear, all sorts of nuclear plants. And we did the same for space because we should really not just take the Artemis, but we should go and do all sorts of work on that. Well, if we did 150 billion for each of that's $450 billion. That would have had more effect on also creating employment and shifting our economy permanently to a state kind of where we could support an energy flux density, true, but a population density far higher than we have right now. You can't try and figure that out by trying to figure out, trying to look at it. Well, our bus system wouldn't support that many people. Our subway system in New York City wouldn't support that many people. Of course it wouldn't. But that's not where we're going. We're changing that entirely. And so you have to get people to see when you make a leap, which doesn't go backwards. Let me just give you one example. What were the top professions during the Revolutionary War? Well, probably blacksmith for shoes and horses, whitesmith who worked with copper and pewter and things like that. Probably teamsters, if they called themselves as such, who were drivers who transported goods. Then look at the same matrix of the top 20 jobs today. They're entirely different. But what allowed that to be different? Because when you change something in an economy, if it's a genuine discontinuity, it just doesn't change one or two things. It changes the entire productive capacity of that. By increasing energy flux density, by increasing cognitive powers of man. And so that's where I think with your friends and your family, you have to get them to see this. And I think simultaneous with this, and I know you know this because I've heard you speak on other things, is you have to change their ability to see what man's mind can create. And where it has not only no limits to growth, but it actually only thrives as it makes new discoveries, going beyond anything that you've previously known. The fact that we realistically, if we really do a crash program, could be putting whole populations living on the moon, working on the questions of Mars within, say, 30 to 50 years. Changes the energy flux density of our solar system. It changes also the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, and I think that's where you have to go. What is the capacity of the mind to change everything that you, who is asking me this question now, why don't we have a limit? If you take it from that standpoint, then it changes everything in terms of what your answer is going to be, and also everything in terms of what the energy supporting that. Fusion is just a completely different economy. And the fact that we have been thwarted since 1945 in developing that is one of the worst things that you can possibly say about what mankind has not done, precisely because of what those potentials are. And so you really have to look at these discontinuous singularity shifts. And I would just say that from the standpoint of a formal looking at that, mathematicians will say, well, there's a discontinuity and the system doesn't work. The standpoint of looking at from a creative standpoint is you say, well, that's not just a discontinuity from between one system and another. It's a singularity in which hyperbolic horns open up to the new system. Lynn used to say that in the singularity, there is negative curvature. It's a different curvature entirely. And if they can grasp that, whatever way you can get that across, then that starts to answer the question.
Okay, so we have one question. Both these questions are from Jose, and one is for Harley, one's for you, Richard. I'm going to ask both of the questions together. All right. So Jose says that we have heard three, and he's talking about the three presentations, including Mike Robinson. We've heard three different accounts of the geopolitical world, all detailing the same thing. the motivation to depopulate the world, making a lot of money off of people suffering. China's response to being excluded from that process shows that they are still sane leaders in the world. How can the population of a country like Britain, that doesn't have a formal constitution, be able to actually stop what's happening? And what about the people here in America? Is it the role of Americans to interfere in other countries? So that's for you, Harley. And then the second part, which Richard would direct you, says, I can see how some people would advocate for something like anarchy when you're surrounded in a government of corruption and destruction. How can anyone ever trust allowing anyone else to come into power? There have been great leaders that have changed the world for the better, but also leaders that have caused irreparable damage for generations to come. So how do you generate something where you can die knowing that the future will be left in great hands? Those are the two questions.
Well, Dennis, let me ask you, can you just summarize the main part of the question for me? Because
the one for you. Yeah, I'll just say what it is. He's saying, well, we've heard these three reports. They all seem to go to the same thing. But China's response to being excluded from, he says, that conference, I don't know exactly what he's referring to there. But he says, well, how can populations like that in Britain, which doesn't even have a formal constitution, actually intervene to stop what's happening? I think that's straightforward. And then what about people in America? Is it the role of Americans to interfere in other countries?
Well, I think he was referring to China's being excluded from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but they still held open for the United States to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative through the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. What's China's ultimate goal here? Is their goal to become the world's leading power and crush the United States? Or is it to uplift their population and to use the capabilities they've developed to help other countries? And I think that's where you see the difference between what the United States has been doing with its interference, where this gets to this question of a rules-based order. And I have a number of quotes that I had intended to use, but I didn't have enough time to find them all. But what Blinken talks about, what Biden talks about, what Pompeo talks about, they all talk about a rules-based order. But they're becoming more explicit in what they mean by that. They mean we make the rules that we want, and everyone has to abide by it. That's called unilateralism. And that's been the policy of the British Empire historically. When they carry out coups, assassinations, launch wars, it's to stop nations that are acting in their own interest for the purpose of their own protection of their financial and trade control. So, the question of what is it the United States does when we interfere, there's something called the responsibility to protect, which is a fraudulent human rights doctrine, which takes as a starting point, if you know that a country is committing genocide against its people and is about to go to war to other countries, do you have a right to intervene to try and change that government or get rid of it? Goes back to the Nuremberg Code, never again. Well, the problem is the people who are telling you what the crimes are of those countries are the people who are trying to stop them from being sovereign. For example, Syria, Iraq, Libya, those were countries that spent much of the income they were getting for developing their population. They're tough places to govern. You have all kinds of religious minorities, ethnic minorities thrown into an artificially drawn border. And yet you had governments like Saddam's government, which were uplifting the standard of living, improving healthcare. They had women in positions of responsibility. The vice president of the country was a Christian. You have a similar thing in Lebanon, where you have multi-ethnic groupings trying to govern the country. And so they have problems sometimes, especially when there's outside interference. And the outside interference is used to stir things up, to create opposition, and then to make those opponents the so-called legitimate government, as they tried to do with Guaido in Venezuela, or they tried to do with the moderate rebels in Syria. And in the process of doing that, they destroyed nations. So, no, we don't have the right to do that. If people request it, the way the Syrians asked the Russians to come in to help them fight terrorism, then that's one thing. But the responsibility to protect is a fraudulent doctrine that's designed to excuse intervention against governments that don't accept the rules-based order. Now, the question on the United Kingdom is a little more difficult, but I'll just make a simple point about it. Many people thought that Brexit was going to bring about a change. They thought that by bringing the United Kingdom out of the European Union, it would be a chance to restore sovereignty. But the problem is, it's not clear that there was ever sovereignty for the English people. As Mike Robinson was pointing out, you have a small grouping that makes the rules in England, in the United Kingdom, without really a constitutional framework to operate from. And so Brexit got hijacked, and it's being turned now into something called Global Britain, which under Boris Johnson, he's intending to use the upcoming G7 meeting to turn it into the D10, which I pointed out in my presentation is the classic example of an alliance to conduct geopolitical warfare. And they're hosting this year's COP26 conference, the environmental conference, the global warming conference in Edinburgh, Scotland. And he's going to try and make that the staging ground for finalizing a global Green New Deal. Is that what the people of England voted for when they voted to have Brexit and leave the European Union? No, so that's the problem. Is there a possibility for a democratic rebellion there? Well, I think there is. I think that's what Brexit showed, that people were not satisfied with the government they have, not satisfied with the lies they get through the media. I mean, 2 weeks ago, Mike exposed how the BBC and Reuters, supposedly the two top objective journalists, newspapers, media sources in the United Kingdom, are agencies of the Foreign Office, of precisely the gang of oligarchs who run the country. So I think these kinds of discussions are reflected in the discussion going on inside Great Britain. I know that I have many people corresponding with me from the United Kingdom who listen to me on various interviews and join my blog and say, how can I find out more? They're signing people up, having a discussion. That's what we need. So we actually need more real democracy. And by that, I mean more people who are functioning as Republican citizens to take back their countries, including in the United States.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, and I agree with Harley on. I mean, this emphasis on what has to be done with China is a pivot. It is the most important question that we can solve in a positive way. We know how to solve it in a positive way. I would say with regard to Britain, remember the key thing about what we're talking about with the monarchy, the oligarchy, the British Empire, is it's not British in that sense. It's an international institution that is situated in Britain. You have kings of this and that country. This is not kings of this and that country. This is an institution that sets up a world imperium. And that's how it plays this game, and that's how it looks at this game. And if that were understood, we would have seen what was happening, because in this crisis, Britain will be eliminated by a financial collapse if Russia and the United States and China work together. Lyndon LaRouche understood that absolutely clearly. The problem was that if you fracture that alliance, potential alliance, and at times realized alliance, then you fracture the ability to actually destroy the British. They will not survive. Their junk heap economy, the financial system will not survive. And that was part of what the attack was on President Trump. It wasn't just on him personally, which it was, but it was on to split that, to drive a wedge between the United States, for example. What the interest is, it's not an interest per se of a country. It's an interest of an international imperial system. And I think the question I would raise in terms, Jose, of your question is this. What would have happened and what can happen if the United States said, look, we have a very pressing question. What happens if we in the United States work right now with Mexico to develop Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, working with China? That, I think, would have produced more jobs. I did a rough off-the-cuff calculation of 1 million manufacturing jobs, and was actually produced by President Trump under what he was trying to do, but I don't think succeeded, though with good intentions. That would have produced at least that amount of jobs, which if we had done real infrastructure building, would have added another 1.5 million manufacturing jobs. That's what's before us. We have to take those things, and specifically, if you want to talk about the immigration question or any other thing other than that, that's the way to do it. And that's something America would jump at every single opportunity, certainly under Roosevelt and certainly under Lincoln. And John Quincy Adams knew that as well. That has to be the principle by which we're going to reconstruct. And that means we have to be in the Belt and Road. Someone raised at a discussion the other week, why don't we just, I think it was Susan Bowen, why don't we say we join the Belt and Road? It's not a formal question. You build these things by processes. We didn't build the Bretton Woods system by just signing on the dotted line. You build it by establishing certain principles, and then you work to realize those principles. And that's the last answer to your question. It's obviously an interesting question. But as I would just say, you have to work from those universal principles. If you do, you will guarantee that you're not following a dictator or something like that. Can you guarantee that we will always succeed? No. But if you do the good, if you are committed to the good, and I know, Jose, you know this because you've been fighting for, what has to be done on space programs repeatedly and educating your friends on this. But if you fight for the good, that's where you develop passion, and your passion also pushes you forward. And that passion makes you intelligent. That gives you the capacity to make the alterations in others because they sense that passion, the passion for the good, and forever trying to make the creative principle the dominant principle. And that is the best approach. There's nothing else. It's that approach. And every time it has been done around the world, we've succeeded. And if we decide as a nation, however we do it, whatever the forum is, to bring Russia and China and the United States together, however we do that, if it's guided by that type of approach, that will totally change the world and answer the other questions you're asking.
And for those who would like to do that right away, you can join us next Saturday when we do our conference, The World at a Crossroad, the first 2 months of the Biden administration. It'll be a conference that we're doing from March 20th and 21st. And you can register there at showinstitute.com. World at a Crossroad, 2 months into the new U.S. administration. What we're going to do now is take the final question for today. And this is a question for you, Harley. And then what we should have is summary remarks from you, Richard, and then Harley, and we'll then conclude. All right, so this question is from Suzanne to Harley, and it is regarding the military Indo-Pacific policy that you discussed. How can the U.S. operate with military strength if we continue to follow the New Green policy, which will continue to erode the U.S. physical economy? How can a rational assessment of the educational level of the U.S. military versus the number of engineers and scientists being graduated in China not be seen as a U.S. problem from the standpoint of national security? Is the idea of warfare itself different from what we considered strength in the past? And is one plan a new kind of warfare, emphasizing cyber warfare and other approaches, including biological and chemical warfare?
Well, it's a broad subject, but let me go back to what Lyndon LaRouche said at the point at which the then Soviet Union rejected Ronald Reagan's offer for a strategic defense initiative, which Lynn had been negotiating on behalf of the Reagan administration with the Soviet Union. What he said is that their policy of the military buildup which was going against the necessary investment in physical infrastructure, in education, and developing their population would lead to a collapse. And so, in a sense, they were forced into what was called the Ogarkov Doctrine, which was a short-term plan because they knew that long-term they wouldn't be able to sustain the level of military investment to keep up with the United States without causing a social revolution in their country. And what Lynn said is that this is how he was able to forecast the collapse of the Soviet Union. He said within 5 years. It actually took a little bit more than that. It was about 6 years, but he was right. It was that process of depleting or underinvesting in the real economy of goods and services for the population in order to have a military buildup, which led to the collapse. Now look at what we're facing today. He then said later on, the United States is moving in that same direction. Now, we have an official military budget of over $700-something billion a year. When you look at the problem we have with China, when we talk about the Taiwan Strait, that is on the water there touches China. When you talk about the South China Sea, that's China. For them to have a military force there is not so difficult. How do we sustain military forces that far away across the Pacific? Well, the idea of the air-sea defense plan was that you use the bases that we have to launch airstrikes. Now they're talking about more missile capabilities, anti-missile capabilities, but you're still talking about static places that are easily identified. It's not so different than Pearl Harbor in 1941. And the Chinese know that. So their military strategy is to come up at the same time with capabilities to block our counterstrikes and use cyber warfare to disrupt our ability to attack them. So the real answer to the question is that either you go into an all-out mobilization for developing new weapons, which would be weapon systems that would be able to cover the whole world and destroy everything in minutes, if not seconds, or you realize that war is insane. And there has to be an urgency about this. The idea that we're going to go into a military buildup in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific region to counter a possible Chinese takeover of Taiwan is an insane concept. This is where the question of negotiation, of diplomacy, of common interest comes into effect. And instead of being in a confrontation, look at the region where the Chinese are mainly operating, South Asia, and then look at their extension into Africa. What are they doing in Africa? They're building nations. They're building corridors of development. They're talking now about working in the Southwest Asia to do the same. That's the way you carry out, in a sense, modern warfare. That you eliminate the need for warfare by having principles of economic development, which is what Pope Paul VI meant when he issued the encyclical, "Development is the name of peace." The idea that you can have bigger and better and faster weapons and that will guarantee peace in an era like today where there's so much disinformation, cyber capabilities, and things of that sort is foolish. So either we realize that, or ultimately we're going to sleepwalk into a World War III, which will be a nuclear war. So I think the question is that you cannot sustain economic development that will keep a population happy and still have the war buildup. Now that's what the Great Reset is about. They're not committed to providing comfortable living standards for people in the advanced sector. We're seeing a middle class that's collapsing in Western Europe and the United States. More and more people are graduating college with no hope of paying off their student debt or buying a home or starting a family. So we're already in a situation where we've extended our capability to actually provide for people outside of extending credit, which ultimately means there's going to be a collapse of purchasing because you're going to lose your credit capability, you're going to be smothered in debt. So either we end this insanity or it will be ended for us in nuclear war. And our friend Jason Ross had a pretty useful comment today when he said, what good is an environment if there are no people around to enjoy it?
Before Richard gives us his final remarks, let me just point out to people this report from our organization from 1997, The True Story Behind the Fall of the House of Windsor, and the article, The Coming Fall of the House of Windsor by Linda LaRouche. I believe that this is in various ways or may be able to be made available for those who are willing to pay the price. But just wanted to indicate for people the quarter century and more history of executive intelligence review in its looking at and monitoring the situation that people all now are becoming more aware of. So, Richard, any final remarks for today?
Yeah, to answer Harley's question, I think Prince Philip might, as a virus, be happy without people. It's a very strange type of person. I think two things. One is that, we need to, as we've identified, this Green Reset, Green New Deal, rewiring, this thing is very much more advanced than we know. Well, not that we know, but it's very, very far advanced, and people are trying to advance it quickly, trying to put it in place ahead of the type of great economic financial collapse. Put this bubble into place. Whether it would work for how long, if only for weeks or months, we will see. But the thing is that we've got the ammunition to stop this. We've got the ammunition to show what this will mean for the takedown of the physical economy, what it will take for the takedown of the agriculture, what it will take down of the plans that have been advanced, that to absolutely take down all of what we would call an industrial republic. And we've got that. We've got the upcoming conference on that, which can be, which we need to make grow. And bring people up to a higher and happier state on this very question. But this question is far more advanced. We can't just be complacent. Oh, well, it's going to happen at some point. It is happening, and we have to take that. We have to internalize that. And I think that simultaneously, this opens up the tremendous possibilities, because every question that's posed here begs the question of how do you build a Hamiltonian credit system? How do you put into place a Hamiltonian bank? How would we build real infrastructure? How do you finance a high-speed rail system that should cover 42,000 miles of electrified rail system in the United States? How do we increase the energy rather than limiting from now until 20 years from now, reducing it? How do we find a way to make it more efficient? We know some of that. We know some of those principles. And that means not just the four laws as four laws as such, which, Glass-Steagall obviously has to come into play, because you can't deal with an oncoming financial system by just making this change here or that change there. The quantitative easing, all of those things those banks have to be broken up, and we have to take away their power. And that's what's key in all of this. Take away their power. Take away the power of the people who are doing this right now, whether they be in Britain or anywhere else in the world. They have to have their power broken, and a new power based on a different objective for mankind and a different view of mankind established. This is the opening. If we go, the optimistic side of this thing, and there's a lot of optimism, despite what looks like a terrible situation, is that we have every fundamental issue posed, and people are not happy trying to be herded into the left and the right, as Mike Robinson pointed out, because those are irrelevant questions. And in that setting, every new issue that's on the table, and it is a mass strike process in the true sense. I mean, Dennis has discussed this before. It's not just people running around being one. The difference between just simple activity and looking for Gates receipts from activity. And the mass strike poses people profound questions. You may not have your house next week. You may not have your job next week. You may not have anything productive being done, and you certainly might not have any future for your children. And in a period like that, when those questions are being posed, you can raise people up to higher questions and issues such as, how do you change the entire system to a Hamiltonian system, which is a system that takes the future and brings credit in to realize that future by the policies that you take today. And I think that next week's conference, but I think that this is a tremendous opportunity, but we have to present accurately what this Green New Deal is. It is a policy of people who waged a campaign between 1932 and 45. They think that they lost the mission. They came back and they're trying to impose the exact same mission, which will end in concentration work camps the same way. They're coming at this thing, and that if we can get people to see that aspect of it, then I think we can defeat it.
All right, thank you. Harley?
Well, the same sense of urgency that Richie just presented on the economic situation, you have to have on the strategic situation. The war danger is real. One of the problems, if you go back in the 20th century, there have been numerous books written which take up the topic. Some even have the headline, Sleepwalking into World War. That populations, because of various mundane day-to-day concerns, including not such mundane ones, but as Richie was saying, whether you have a house, whether you have a job, whether your children have health care, these things preoccupy people. They take up most of the energy and mental consideration. And so people don't have the time to consider the fact that we may be starting a war with our policies. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean it's not real. It is happening. The fact that the military is conducting war games to try to figure out how to lose less quickly to China ought to tell you something. We can't let these wars happen. And so the same sense of urgency by which we look at the 4 laws of Lyndon LaRouche, the economic policies, as essential if there's going to be a future, we have to take that same urgency toward ensuring that Lynn's idea of the 4 powers, that the 4 nations that are most powerful vis-a-vis the British Empire, namely the United States, Russia, China, and India, come together in some form in a series of meetings to construct a new strategic architecture that operates from the standpoint of common interests of mankind, as opposed to geopolitical advantage of a small fraction of the world's population. This is real. And I don't know any other way to say it than to go back to some of the quotes I read about the military people who are planning how to conduct war with China and beginning to realize that it's not a slam dunk the way many people think. So instead of coming out into a situation, sleepwalking into that, let's make sure we have the summits that are necessary, the discussions that's necessary, and the fights that are necessary with our friends and coworkers to get them to start thinking this way. And that's what we're going to try and do with our conference next weekend.
All right. Well, I want to thank Richard Freeman and Harley Schlanger for joining us today. And of course, we want to thank everybody that joined us, wherever you happen to be tuning in from, for today's webcast of the LaRouche organization. Let us say now again, the conference will be a 2-day conference. It will be going on March 20th and March 21st, Schiller Institute Conference, The World at a Crossroad, 2 months into the new U.S. administration. And I'd just like to take a moment to give a kind of sense of one of the topics that we'll be talking about in the first panel. First panel will be, it's sort of called the science of culture. And to give you an idea of how different we think of that topic as, I'd like to invite you to think about a program that NASA has been using in the prisons of the United States. called Astrobiology for the Incarcerated. It's a program that was begun through the efforts of Daniela Scalise, who was the head of NASA's education program in astrobiology. And she met a scientist from the University of Utah in Salt Lake City who had been bringing science education into the prison systems for nearly 20 years. And what Daniela Scalise says she realized is that the transformative history and future of life in the universe could be especially relevant to people within incarcerated facilities. This is an important idea because this principle of power in society is one that we believe must be associated with the idea and the power of poetry, the principle of poetry, the ability to say to communicate a profound and impassioned conception in great language. Friedrich Schiller contended that persons such as Solon of Athens created law and created therefore justice in that sense through poetry. And the Constitution of Athens was actually a poem that Solon recited. And certainly when you look at something like the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, or you look at something like the Declaration of Independence's early paragraphs, the idea of an elevated both language, which is the raiment, the clothing of an elevated conception. This is what humanity requires in order for different nations and different cultures to understand one another's commonality as human beings. From the beginning of today's webcast, we've made that point. But I would invite you to think about what this would mean to be teaching astrobiology, the history and the science of the origins, history, and future of life in the universe as a whole to people who were incarcerated. And let's suppose we're talking about somebody who's in solitary confinement, which means you get out 1 hour a day. Let's suppose that you're talking about someone who's actually committed a crime, let's say a serious crime, and the person's guilty, and the person is in for a long time. And they get the chance to go out, perhaps at night, or put up there and do something that Sarah Al-Amiri, the head of the United Arab Emirates program, has talked about. Put your finger up into the sky and look at what is behind your fingertip. If you take that away and you look at what you see in the sky, you're seeing literally hundreds of galaxies. Not, in other words, single stars, but groups and clusters of stars just within the domain of your fingertip. If you give a person who's wrong and been wrong the idea that the crime that you have committed need not define either the rest of your life or your outlook as a human being, there's a principle of power, the power of humanity, that allows you to supersede your crime, your limitations, your failures, your axioms. It's this idea of classical culture, the principle of power in that culture, which is the core basis for the idea of physical economy that Leonard LaRouche taught, and which you'll see if you did not see the beginning of this webcast in his own words. So what we want to do at our conference is to make it clear to people that there is a possibility to establish a planetary culture which is capable of elevating nations and cultures being involved in that. And so that is our approach. We're not just talking about music and art, and certainly not for art's sake. We're talking about the power and the principle of power, a power that goes beyond violence, a power that goes beyond subjugation, a power that goes beyond win-lose, to a power which allows us to understand that it's the common humanity of the human race, as you see expressed in the dance around the skies of Mars being done by the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and China right now. That is the directionality that the human race should take, and that backward ideas, reactionary ideas in science and culture have no real place in that future. And so we invite you to be part of the, not merely the audience, but the participants in that conference that will happen next week. We invite you all to help us organize that conference. It's a virtual conference, so anyone can attend from anywhere where they have a computer or a cell phone or whatever. And so we hope that when you participate with us in that conference, it will be over Saturday and Sunday, you will decide to take the role that you are destined to have, if you will, from the standpoint of your true nature as a human being and the freedom that that gives you to act and think and create. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank you for being with us here today. And next week, we hope to see you at that Schiller conference, The World at a Crossroad, the 2 months into the United States administration. Good afternoon.